One of the most contentious disagreements related to gender equality in the United States is the so-called gender pay gap. Some say that women make only 77 cents for every dollar that a man makes, and others insist that there is no gender pay gap whatsoever.
Today, women make up about half our workforce, but they still make 77 cents for every dollar a man earns.
Another contemporary economic myth is that women make 75 cents for every dollar men make because they're discriminated against in labor markets.
Force. Nationally, women working full-time are paid 77 cents for every dollar paid to men.
The wage gap claim is one of the most persistent pieces of misinformation of our times.
Today, women earn 77 cents for each dollar earned by men.
The claim that women earn less than men for the same work is false.
And yet women take home only 77 cents for every dollar a man earns for the same job.
Debate has raged for a long time about precisely how wide the gender pay gap is, or if it even exists. We've all heard this common meme that women are paid 77 cents for every dollar that a man makes, but is this really the most accurate representation of how wide the pay gap is? No. Are those who say that the pay gap is a delusion altogether correct? Also, no. The truth is somewhere in between. So let's look at what the gender pay gap really is, what causes it, and how it could be fixed. The American Industrial Revolution saw the first major emergence of women in the workforce, but in 1850, American women were being paid about half of what men make. By 1930, after the creation of many new secretarial and sales jobs, women's pay increased to about 56 cents on every dollar made by men. The period between 1950 and 1980 saw unprecedented feminism, but women's pay was still consistently only about 60% that of men. But to find out what these numbers tell us, we need to know how they're calculated, and that's by taking the median yearly income of full-time, full-year working women from the 2011 U.S. Census and dividing it by that of full-time, full-year working men. If you were to calculate today's gender pay gap using this equation, it would look like women are only making about 77% of what men make. Today, it's risen a little bit to almost 79%. But does this 77 or 79 cents on the dollar figure make sense in figuring out what the gender pay gap really is? I mean, dividing men and women's yearly incomes only tells us that women earn less on average, and not necessarily that women are being paid less for the same work or when they have the same qualifications. Using this overly simplistic equation that gives us 77%, if a woman with inferior qualifications is compared to a man with more qualifications and she's paid less, we might come away with a false impression that she was a victim of discrimination given the simplicity of the 77% statistic. In 2013, the Labor Department determined the difference in men and women's median pay on a week-by-week basis, which can help us to sort of adjust for the amount of the year that men and women work. And those calculations showed a 19-cent difference, 81 cents for every dollar that a man makes. And when the numbers were further reduced to an hour-by-hour basis, the gap shrank even more to about 15 cents or 85 cents for every dollar that a man makes. This already differs significantly from that 77 cents on the dollar claim. Today, we actually do have access to enough data to make assessments about the gender pay gap that are more refined and valid. Merely dividing the median incomes fails to account for any factors that are relevant to determining the actual causes of differences in pay between men and women. Not only must we determine what the actual wage gap is between men and women, we then need to somehow account for how much of that is a result of gender discrimination. Not an easy task. Now, economists have done work to study the pay gap and have more sophisticated methods of calculating its size in a way that does acknowledge outside factors other than just the number of hours that are being worked, as well as different types of work and different types of workers. But even when you have an algorithm that accounts for all of this crucial data, creating a more accurate comparison that uses the appropriate controls and constraints like ethnicity, union membership, past work experience, type of job, etc., women are still making less money. After this adjustment, we see that women are still only being paid about 89 to 91 cents for every dollar that a man makes for the same work and when they have the same qualifications. So what causes this? Where are women losing approximately 10 cents? A common refrain from those who believe that there is no gender pay gap is that a gender pay gap might appear to exist because men are, generally speaking, more qualified. This is flatly untrue today. Women earn more college degrees than men, and they have since the 1980s. We have a 2012 Pew poll that shows that 71% of female high school graduates enroll in college, while only 61% of their male counterparts enroll, a rate that hasn't increased for men in over 18 years. And in college, women also have higher GPAs and higher graduation rates. Women earn more associate's degrees than men, more bachelor's degrees than men, more master's degrees than men, and more doctoral degrees than men. Men and women are basically equal in terms of how much work experience they have, and study after study has shown that men and women's IQ are basically the same. Okay, so women aren't less qualified than men, and they aren't less intelligent or less competent. This gets us to possibly the most common false explanation for the gender pay gap. Women simply choose to enter lower paying jobs. For example, more women become nurses and more men become doctors. So of course women are going to be paid less since they're choosing professions that pay less. But as it turns out, job selection only accounts for about 25% of the difference between men and women's income, and that calculation alone ignores an exploration of why the jobs women may gravitate towards pay less than those that men gravitate towards to begin with, which we'll discuss too. But the other 75% of the pay gap still exists within specific fields and occupations. So why is this? Harvard economist Claudia Golden, who uses the more sophisticated calculations that give us about a 10% pay difference between men and women, could find only one factor that is responsible for the pay gap after adjusting for other variables. When contrasting equitable work by men and women, Golden determined that in large part the gender pay gap exists because women spend more time than men caring for their families. When men and women first graduate from college and enter the workforce, women even begin their careers making about 7% less than men. And that's even using the proper constraints we've mentioned. But by 10 or 15 years later, when workers begin to have children, we start to see the pay gap becoming even worse, and it only gets wider as women get older. New fathers actually tend to become more involved with their careers after having kids, getting more promotions and raises, while women's income growth becomes much slower and the gap therefore grows. And on average, women with children are paid about 7% less per child than women without children. Women's time with their families contributes to their slower income growth because of their need for what's referred to as temporal flexibility in their jobs, because a disproportionate amount of family care and the burdens are placed on women. They generally need more time off. They're less able to work weekends and odd hours, and they tend to be less able to travel. Is this fair to women? Even in jobs where they work the same number of hours as men, they have to seek more jobs with flexibility like days off, home hours, or self-allotted hours, and thus they are paid less in the bigger picture, either by needing to choose a job with more flexibility and less pay, or by receiving fewer promotions because they're less available. One study has even shown that employers are less likely to even hire women whom they know have children. So what's the solution? Obviously, men aren't going to start birthing children anytime soon, and it's unlikely that women will, for example, stop caring for their elderly parents. And obviously, it's not the fault of women for needing flexibility to care for their families if they're the ones who are more willing to do so as a result of societal realities.
In today's economy, when having both parents in the workforce is an economic necessity for many families, we need affordable, high-quality child care more than ever.
The K-12 school day could be longer, or school could be held year-round. Laws could be made that guarantee women receive paid maternity leave or require men to take paid leave when they've had a child, or they could at least offer men paid time off that would disappear if not used to care for family. But these could understandably be considered very heavy-handed actions. Countries like Norway, Sweden, and Iceland have this type of evaporating family leave for fathers, especially to counteract the pay gap caused by women's unfair need for temporal flexibility. New fathers in Norway are legally entitled to 12 weeks of paid leave. These countries call it the daddy quota, and they've been very successful in shrinking pay gaps by leveling the playing field in this way. Not to mention, we are the only highly developed country in the world that doesn't even provide women with paid maternity leave. This is a serious political issue. In the 1970s and 80s, orchestras in the US widely changed their audition process to include a blind screen between the judges and the auditioning musician, so that the audition would only be heard and not seen. And orchestras that implemented this saw a 50% rise in their hiring of female applicants. There have been a number of experiments conducted by Harvard in conjunction with Carnegie Mellon University, which have demonstrated that women are more likely than men to be punished for attempting to negotiate pay. An INSEAD study found results which suggest that within professional networks, people are less likely to help women with their careers, and it also inferred that women need better educational credentials than men to enter some of the same career fields. And I was talking about occupational segregation earlier. Economist David Newmark says that outright hiring discrimination may be in part what causes women to go to lower paying jobs in the first place. Pay secrecy is something else that contributes to pay inequality and allows for discrimination. Almost half of workers in the U.S. are illegally asked by their employers not to discuss their pay with coworkers, and a study has shown that women are asked far more often than men to stay quiet about their salary. Since 2009, President Obama and other Democrats have been pushing for a bill called the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would strengthen enforcement against all employers who punish workers for discussing pay, and it would require them to justify differences in pay between two employees of the same qualifications. The act has been blocked and filibustered by Republicans who have done so 3 times since 2009. By current projections, if nothing is done to counteract the inequality that is the gender pay gap in the U.S., it will last until the year 2058. This would mean that 2 entire generations of women who haven't even been born yet would be subjected to unequal pay. U.S. states with the smallest gender pay gap are states with their own specific laws aimed at mitigating income inequality, such as the Nevada Equal Pay Law or the Florida Civil Rights Act, which have provisions that even more specifically prohibit discrimination and enable the enforcement thereof. Clearly, of course, there is much left to do in combating all of this. As I mentioned before, President Obama has spent his entire presidency trying to get the Paycheck Fairness Act passed, which would be a big step in the right direction in terms of pay transparency and penalizing employers that discriminate.
We know our economy is stronger when our wives, our mothers, our daughters can live their lives free from discrimination in the workplace and free from the fear of domestic violence.
So the gender pay gap is not as bad as the 23 cents or even 20 cents on the dollar, realistically. In giving a more meaningful, useful calculation of the pay gap, it's probably more in the ballpark of 9 to 11% to differentiate between men and women's pay when the proper adjustments and controls are applied. But this gap is still definitely a huge inequity and a problem for which effectual solutions are overdue. Different combinations of things I've mentioned play into the gap's existence, including unfair penalties to mothers, and undoubtedly some discrimination also is happening. But what is for certain is that in 2016, about half of America's workforce is female, and about 40% of U.S. households rely on a woman as their primary breadwinner. So huge numbers of families are being impacted by the imbalance. How can we disregard half of the U.S. workforce, not to mention half of the human race? In the same jobs, under the same circumstances, there are no valid reasons why women should be paid less than men. And considering the capacities of the federal government, There are no reasons why we should continue to let it happen. Women deserve to feel valued day to day in the workplace, in the larger economy, and as people. We've been falling short of this. We've made progress. It's not 23 cents on the dollar, but it does exist, and we need to find solutions.